A kid tried to steal a police dog's food. What the dog did next left the town speechless. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The night was colder than usual, and the boy pulled his torn denim jacket tighter around his small frame. His bare feet were numb against the rough pavement, his stomach twisting with hunger as he shuffled forward, eyes darting around to make sure no one was watching. The police station loomed ahead, its windows glowing with the dim light of the overnight shift. This was the third night in a row he had walked by, watching, waiting. He had seen the large dog before. A massive German shepherd, stronger and taller than any dog he'd ever seen. It lived in the fenced yard behind the station, where the police officers let it roam at night. And every evening, just before they locked up, they left a big metal bowl of food outside its kennel. He had never dared to get close. Until now, the hunger was too much tonight. His stomach clenched painfully, and he swallowed hard. He had tried everything, begging, sneaking scraps from behind restaurants, even digging through garbage bins. But nothing. Tonight, he had nothing, and so he was going to steal the dog's food. The plan was simple. Get in, grab a handful, get out before anyone saw. His heart pounded as he crept toward the fence. The dog wasn't in its kennel. It was lying near the far side of the yard, its ears twitching as it rested. It hadn't seen him yet. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. One chance. He slipped through a loose section of the fence, careful not to make a sound. The metal bowl sat just a few feet away, filled with kibble. His fingers twitched, just a little, just enough to stop the hunger pains. He took another step forward, then froze. A deep, low growl rumbled through the yard. His blood turned to ice. He turned his head slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The dog was awake. It was standing now, its powerful body tense, its eyes locked onto him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the dog stepped forward. The boy panicked. He scrambled backward, his hands trembling. He had seen police dogs before. He knew they were trained to take down criminals, to chase, to bite. And he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The dog stepped closer, its growl deepening. The boy stumbled, his foot catching on the edge of the food bowl, sending it clattering against the pavement. The sound echoed in the empty yard. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear. The dog was only a foot away now, and then it stopped. The boy braced himself for the worst, but the worst never came. Instead, the dog did something he never expected, something that would change everything. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the sharp pain of teeth sinking into his arm. He had seen it happen before, how these dogs tackled grown men to the ground, how they held on until their handlers called them off. But the pain never came. Instead, something warm pressed against his hand. His breath hitched as he slowly cracked his eyes open. The dog had lowered its head and nudged his fingers gently with its snout. The boy stared in shock. The massive canine wasn't attacking him. It was offering him its food. His hands trembled as he slowly pulled them away, but the dog nudged him again, this time pushing the metal bowl toward him with its nose. The boy's breath came in uneven bursts. This had to be a trick, right? Police dogs weren't like this. They weren't kind. They weren't gentle. They were trained to be weapons. Yet here was this enormous, powerful creature, lowering itself onto its front paws, wagging its tail slightly, staring at him with something that looked almost understanding. The boy's stomach twisted with hunger. His fingers hovered over the food, hesitating. He had never taken something that was freely given to him before. Not in a long time, but the hunger one. Slowly, cautiously, he picked up a handful of kibble and shoved it into his mouth. The taste was dry, grainy, but he didn't care. It was food, and it was the best thing he had eaten in days. The dog watched him in silence, not moving, not growling, just waiting. He grabbed another handful, chewing quickly, feeling his body relax for the first time that night. Then, a voice shattered the quiet. "Hey!" The boy's body seized with panic. He spun toward the sound, toward the back door of the police station. just in time to see a tall figure stepping outside. A cop. His chest tightened. He had been caught. The officer's flashlight cut through the dark, landing directly on him. For a single second, everything was still. Then the boy turned and ran. His heart pounded as his feet slammed against the pavement, his lungs burning as he sprinted toward the fence. He had to get out, had to escape. He barely made it 2 steps before he felt something slam into him from behind. A sharp gasp tore from his lips as he hit the ground. Hard. He struggled, kicking, fighting, but the weight pinning him down was unmovable. The dog. For the first time, it had acted like a police canine, and he was trapped. The weight on his back was crushing, firm, yet controlled. The boy let out a choked gasp, struggling beneath the dog's heavy frame, his small fingers clawing at the pavement. His instincts screamed at him to run, to break free, but every time he shifted, the canine pressed down harder, ensuring he stayed in place. His breath came in short, panicked bursts, the cold night air stinging his throat. He could hear the officer approaching, footsteps growing louder, more certain. He had been caught. No more running. The flashlight beam was directly on him now, casting harsh light against his dirty face and the tattered fabric of his too-thin jacket. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, his mind flashing through all the worst possibilities. He had stolen before. Small things, scraps of food, things no one would miss. But this was different. This was police property. A crime. Would they take him away? Lock him up? He was just a kid. But that had never stopped people from treating him like a problem before. He had learned early on that the world had little patience for kids like him. Alone, unwanted, hungry. The officer stopped just a few feet away. "Rex," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Stand down." The pressure lifted almost instantly. The boy coughed as the weight disappeared, his arms shaking as he tried to push himself up. His first instinct was to scramble to his feet, to run, but before he could, a hand gripped his shoulder. Not rough, but strong enough to keep him from bolting. "Hey," the officer said. "I'm not gonna hurt you, kid." The boy didn't look at him. His heart was still hammering, his entire body poised to flee the second he had an opening. But the officer didn't yank him up, didn't drag him away in cuffs. Instead, he crouched down beside him, letting go of his shoulder. "What's your name?" the officer asked. Silence. The boy stared at the ground, jaw clenched. His fingers twitched against the pavement, dirt and dust clinging to his small hands. "All right," the officer sighed. "We'll get to that later. But let's start with something simple. Why were you sneaking around the station?" The boy's throat felt tight. His body ached with exhaustion, his stomach still twisting with hunger despite the food he had managed to eat. His hands curled into fists. What was the point of lying? They had seen everything. He swallowed hard. "I was hungry." The words barely came out. A hoarse, whispered admission. The officer didn't react the way he expected. There was no anger, no sharp reprimand, no accusations. Instead, there was a long pause, followed by a slow exhale. The officer shifted, looking down at the dog sitting calmly beside him. "You were stealing from him, then?" The boy hesitated, glancing at the dog. "Rex." Even now, after pinning him down, after stopping his escape, the canine didn't seem angry. There was no growling, no bared teeth. Just quiet, steady eyes watching him carefully. The boy nodded. "Yeah." The officer rubbed a hand over his jaw, thoughtful. "And he let you, huh?" That part still didn't make sense. Why had the dog let him? The boy's fingers twitched. I don't know why." The officer studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, come on, kid." Panic flared in the boy's chest as the officer stood, offering a hand. He flinched back, instinctively pulling away. "No, I'm not." "You're not in trouble," the officer interrupted. His tone was too even, too calm. "I just want to talk. You're freezing, and you look like you haven't eaten properly in days." The boy bit his lip, glancing toward the fence. He could make a run for it. He could still escape if he tried. But then his gaze flickered back to Rex. The dog was still sitting, ears perked, tail flicking slightly against the ground. He wasn't restraining him anymore, but there was something in his expression. Something steady, something safe. The boy swallowed. He wasn't used to people wanting to help. Slowly, hesitantly, he placed his small hand into the officer's larger one. The warmth inside the station was almost suffocating after the bitter cold outside. The boy stood awkwardly near the entrance, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his too-thin jacket, his gaze flickering around the unfamiliar space. He had never been inside a police station before. It wasn't as terrifying as he had imagined. Rex padded in beside him, tail wagging slightly as he trotted toward his kennel. The boy's gaze followed him, still stunned by how gentle the dog was, how different he was from what he had imagined Police K9S to be. The officer returned with a cup of hot chocolate and a sandwich, setting them on the desk in front of the boy. "Eat," he said simply. The boy hesitated. He wasn't used to kindness coming without a price. Still, his stomach ached with hunger, and the smell of food was too much to resist. He grabbed the sandwich and took a bite, barely able to stop himself from devouring it all in seconds. The hot chocolate was warm against his frozen fingers, sending heat all the way down to his toes. The officer sat down across from him. "You got a name, kid?" The boy swallowed his bite, shifting uncomfortably. He could lie. He could make up something and disappear as soon as he got the chance. But something told him that wouldn't work this time. "Leo," the officer nodded. "All right, Leo. I'm Officer Grant." Leo didn't respond. He kept eating, glancing at the dog every so often. "You live around here?" Grant asked. Leo tensed. He stared down at the table, his fingers tightening around the cup of hot chocolate. "Leo," Grant said gently, "do you have anyone looking for you?" Silence. A lump formed in Leo's throat. He had spent so long alone, so long moving from place to place, that he had stopped hoping that someone out there was looking for him. He forced himself to shake his head. "No," Grant sighed. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. "All right," he nodded toward Rex. "He likes you, you know." Leo glanced at the dog, who was now lying near the desk, his massive head resting on his paws. He was watching Leo with that same steady, thoughtful gaze. Leo swallowed. "Why?" Grant chuckled. "That's the real mystery, isn't it?" He studied the boy carefully. Rex doesn't trust easily. He's trained to read people. If he trusts you, there's a reason. Leo wasn't sure how to respond to that. For the first time in a long time, he felt safe. He didn't know what was going to happen next. Didn't know if he'd be sent away, if this small moment of kindness would be taken from him like everything else had been. But for now, for the first time in years, he wasn't hungry, he wasn't cold, and he wasn't alone. Leo finished the last bite of his sandwich, his hands still wrapped tightly around the warm cup of hot chocolate. He could feel the heat spreading through his body, chasing away the cold that had settled in his bones. For the first time in days, he felt human again. But that didn't mean he was safe. He had been in places like this before, brief moments of kindness before being sent away, before people decided he was someone else's problem. That was always how it went. Someone would feed him, ask him a few questions, then call someone social services, a foster home, a shelter. He never lasted long in any of them. He knew how this ended. And yet, this time felt different. The officer, Grant, hadn't asked him about running away, hadn't grabbed a phone the second he finished eating. He was watching Leo carefully, sure, but there was no pity in his expression, no condescending softness that said, "Poor kid, what do we do with him?" It was something else, something more like curiosity. Rex shifted near the desk, his big paws stretching out in front of him as he let out a soft huff of air. His dark eyes were still on Leo, still watching. Not in a way that made Leo uncomfortable, but in a way that made him feel seen. "You really don't have anyone looking for you?" Grant asked again, his voice quiet but firm. Leo hesitated. The truth was, he didn't know. His mother had been gone for over a year, vanished. One day she was there, the next she wasn't. No note, no warning, just gone. He had been shuffled through a few homes after that, but nothing stuck. Eventually, he stopped trying to stay in one place. He shook his head. "No." Grant exhaled through his nose. "How old are you, kid?" Leo hesitated. 9, that part was a lie. He was 10. But he had learned that being younger made people more likely to help, more likely to assume he wasn't used to fending for himself. Grant didn't react. If he knew Leo was lying, he didn't call him out on it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. Rex doesn't trust people easily, he said. Took me months before he even let me touch him when I first got assigned to him. Leo glanced at the dog again, his fingers tightening around the cup. Why is he like that? Grant smirked. He's been trained to think everyone's a threat. It's his job. He's supposed to chase bad guys, not feed them. He nodded toward the dog. And yet, the second you showed up, he let you take his food like it was nothing. Leo didn't know how to respond. He hadn't done anything special. He had just been desperate. You remind him of something, Grant continued. Or someone. Leo frowned. Like who? Grant sighed. Wish I knew. But that dog's never acted like that with anyone before. The weight of his words settled in Leo's chest. He wasn't sure why, but a strange feeling crept into his stomach. Like this moment, this connection with Rex, was important. Like it meant something. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, finally, Grant stood. All right, kid. You're staying here tonight. Leo's eyes snapped up. What? You heard me. Grant stretched his arms, rolling his shoulders. You're not going back out there in the cold. Not when you've got nowhere to go. Leo tensed. You're not calling anyone? Grant watched him for a long beat. Not yet. Leo didn't know what to say. He had never not been sent away immediately. This didn't make sense. Why? He asked finally. Grant shrugged. I want to know why Rex likes you. Leo blinked. That's it. Grant smirked. That, and maybe I'm not a complete jerk who lets a starving kid freeze outside. Leo bit his lip, unsure whether to trust him. But he didn't have a choice, did he? Grant nodded toward the corner of the room. There's a cot in the back. It's not the Ritz, but it's better than sleeping outside. Leo hesitated. He could still run. He could still get out of here before they changed their minds. But Rex let out a soft chuff, stretching his front paws out before resting his head on them again. The dog's calmness made something in Leo settle. Maybe, just for one night, he could stop running. Just for one night. The cot was old, the sheets scratchy, but Leo didn't care. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't lying on concrete, wasn't curling up under an overpass or hiding in the back of a store. He had a pillow, and Rex was lying right next to the cot. Leo had never seen a police dog sleep before, but Rex looked completely at peace. His massive frame curled up at the base of the cot, his tail flicking slightly every so often. It was weird. You really don't trust anyone, huh? Leo whispered, staring at the dog. Rex's ear twitched, but he didn't open his eyes. Leo swallowed. He knew how that felt. For a long time, he just lay there, listening to the quiet sounds of the station. Grant was somewhere in the back, probably finishing paperwork or making a few calls. But he wasn't hovering, wasn't keeping an eye on him like he expected. It was nice. He should have been more scared. But for some reason, he wasn't. His fingers curled into the blanket, his breathing slowing. For the first time in over a year, Leo felt like maybe, just maybe, he was somewhere safe. Morning came too soon. Leo blinked groggily, momentarily forgetting where he was. The station was quiet, but the smell of coffee and something warm drifted through the air. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. Rex was gone. For a moment, panic flashed through his chest. Had they already taken him away? Had he slept through someone calling social services? Then the door opened, and Grant walked in with a plate of food. Leo froze. You eat eggs, right? Grant asked, setting the plate down on the desk. If not, tough luck. I'm not a chef. Leo just stared. There were eggs, toast, bacon. An actual meal. You gonna eat or just sit there looking at it? Grant raised an eyebrow. Leo didn't hesitate this time. He grabbed the plate and started eating, barely chewing before swallowing. He didn't care that it was hot, that the eggs were slightly overcooked. It was food. Grant smirked, sipping his coffee as he watched. Figured you'd be hungry. Leo nodded quickly, finishing half the plate in record time. When he finally slowed, Grant leaned against the desk. "So, what's the plan, kid?" Leo tensed. "Plan? You gonna disappear again the second I turn my back?" Leo hesitated. He wanted to say no, but he didn't know if he could trust this. Grant seemed to sense his hesitation because he sighed. "Look, no one's forcing you to stay, but I'm gonna find out where you came from." Leo's grip on the fork tightened. "I don't have anywhere." Grant tilted his head. "That's so?" Leo swallowed. "Yeah." Grant studied him for a moment. Then finally he nodded. "All right, then let's figure something out." Leo blinked. "Figure what out?" Grant smirked. "That depends, kid. You want to work with a police dog?" Leo's stomach flipped. "What?" Grant nodded toward Rex, who had just walked back in. "Rex seems to like you. Maybe it's time we find out why." Leo didn't know what to say, but for the first time in his life, he didn't want to run. Leo's fork hovered over the plate, his grip tightening as Grant's words settled in his head. "You want to work with a police dog?" He stared at Grant, trying to figure out if this was a joke, a test, or just another way to keep him from running. But the officer's face was unreadable, his smirk lingering as he leaned back in his chair, waiting for an answer. Leo glanced at Rex, who had padded over to him, his tail flicking slightly. The dog sat beside the desk, his big dark eyes locked onto Leo like he was expecting something. "Two," he swallowed. "You're serious?" Grant shrugged. "Why not?" He took a sip of his coffee, watching Leo over the rim of the cup. "Rex doesn't warm up to people. Not like this. Hell, half the department still thinks he's a little too mean to be a K9. But you," he gestured toward the dog. "He trusts you, and that means something." Leo shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. He wasn't used to people thinking he meant something. It had always been easier to just exist in the background, to be ignored. It was safer that way, less chance of getting hurt. And yet, here he was, in a police station, sitting across from an officer who wasn't calling social services, wasn't dragging him away, wasn't making him feel like a problem. And a dog, a police dog, was sitting beside him like they had always known each other, like they belonged together. Leo swallowed hard. "I don't know how to do any of that stuff." Grant smirked. "Then maybe it's time you learn." Leo hesitated, his fingers twitching against the edge of the plate. The offer sounded impossible, too good to be real. "What's the catch?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Grant chuckled. "Smart kid." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "The catch is you gotta stick around. You can't just take off whenever you feel like it. No stealing, no disappearing, no lying." Leo clenched his jaw. "I don't lie." Grant raised an eyebrow. "Your name is actually Leo?" Leo's stomach twisted. "Yeah," he muttered, looking away. Grant didn't push. He just sighed. "Look, kid, I'm not here to mess with you. I'm giving you an option. You don't have to take it. But if you do," he nodded at Rex, "that dog is yours now. At least, for as long as you want him to be." Leo felt something sharp twist in his chest. Something he didn't recognize. A feeling he didn't know how to name. He looked at Rex again, the dog still sitting there, still watching him with those steady, knowing eyes. Could he really stay? Would this really be different? His fingers curled into a fist beneath the table. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself hope. The next few days passed in a strange, dreamlike blur. Leo didn't leave. He thought about it more times than he could count. Every time he woke up on the cot in the back room, every time he caught sight of the door and remembered how easy it would be to just walk out. But every time Rex was there, watching him, keeping him anchored. Grant had started letting him help with small things, cleaning up around the station, checking on Rex's gear, even walking with them during training drills. It wasn't much, but it felt real, like he was part of something, like he belonged. And then, on the fourth day, everything changed. "Leo," Grant called from across the yard. Leo turned, wiping sweat from his forehead. He had been helping one of the younger officers clean out an old storage unit when Grant's voice cut through the air. Something in his tone made Leo's stomach clench. He jogged over, Rex immediately falling into step beside him. "What's going on?" Leo asked as he reached Grant. The officer's face was tense, his usual smirk replaced with something more serious. He was holding a manila folder in his hands, the edges worn from being handled too many times. "Got something for you," Grant said, handing it over. Leo hesitated before taking it, his fingers shaking slightly. He flipped the folder open, his breath catching in his throat the second he saw what was inside. A photo of him, not from the station, not from now, from before. Leo's chest tightened. It was old, slightly crumpled, but there was no mistaking it. His face was younger, his clothes cleaner, his eyes not as tired. And standing beside him, his mother. His hands started shaking. "Where did you get this?" Grant exhaled. "You're not just some random runaway, kid." Leo's heart pounded. "Your mom," Grant said carefully. "She reported you missing 2 years ago." Leo's stomach dropped. He could barely hear anything over the rushing sound in his ears. His mom. She had been looking for him? "That's not possible," he whispered. "Kid." "No," Leo shook his head, his grip on the folder tightening. "She left. She didn't come back. She didn't want me." Grant's expression softened. "That's not what happened." Leo's breath hitched. He wanted to run, wanted to disappear before the truth could hurt him. But Rex nudged his side, his warmth grounding him, keeping him from spiraling. Grant sighed. "We're gonna find her, Leo. But I need you to trust me." Leo swallowed hard, his eyes burning. Trust. He had never been good at that. But as Rex pressed his nose against his arm, as Grant stood there, patient, not pushing him, for the first time in a long time, he thought maybe he could. Leo's hands clenched the folder so tightly that the edges crumpled beneath his fingers. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. His mother had been looking for him for 2 years? That didn't make sense. None of this made sense. He forced himself to take a breath, but it came out shaky. His eyes flicked between the photo and Grant, his mind refusing to process what he was being told. "You're lying," he muttered. Grant sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Kid, you're lying." Leo's voice rose, his chest tightening with something sharp and overwhelming. "She left. She didn't come back. She..." His voice caught in his throat, choking on the weight of the memories pressing down on him. He remembered the last day he saw her, the way she had told him she was going to find work, how she kissed the top of his head and promised she'd be back soon. But she never came back. He had waited for hours, then days, then weeks, until eventually he stopped waiting. Grant exhaled, his jaw tightening. "Leo, I wouldn't lie to you about this." The boy shook his head, backing up a step, the folder clutched against his chest like a shield. "Maybe she looked for me a little," he muttered, voice shaking. "Maybe she cared for a while, but she stopped. She didn't come back. She..." His breath hitched, and for the first time, he felt tears burning behind his eyes. He couldn't cry. Not here. Not now. A soft nudge at his side made him flinch. Rex. The dog had stepped closer, his big head pressing gently against Leo's arm, solid and warm. His soft brown eyes were steady, calm, offering something Leo couldn't name. Leo's shoulders shook. He had spent so long convincing himself he was unwanted, forgotten, left behind. It was easier that way. It hurt less than hoping. But now Grant was telling him that his mother never stopped looking. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, Rex's fur beneath his fingers grounding him, keeping him from falling apart completely. "Where is she?" he whispered. Grant exhaled, stepping forward. "We don't know yet, but we will. You just have to trust me." Leo's throat felt too tight. Trust. That word again. Slowly, carefully, he nodded, because for the first time in years, he wanted to believe. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Leo barely spoke. His thoughts were too tangled, too heavy. He sat on the bench in the station, the manila folder resting beside him, untouched. He hadn't opened it again. He couldn't. Grant had gone back to his desk, making phone calls, talking to people, doing whatever police officers did when they were trying to find someone. Leo knew he should feel hopeful, but instead he just felt numb. He had spent so long believing she had left him on purpose, that she had moved on, forgotten him, started a new life without looking back. But if Grant was right, if she had actually been searching for him, what did that mean? A low whine pulled him from his thoughts. Rex sat at his feet, head resting on Leo's knee, his warm brown eyes watching him closely. Leo swallowed the lump in his throat and ran his fingers through the dog's fur, letting the movement calm his racing thoughts. "Do you think it's real?" he murmured. "That she actually wants me back?" Rex let out a soft chuff, pressing his head harder against Leo's leg. Leo huffed a quiet laugh. "Yeah, I guess you don't lie, huh?" The door to the station creaked open, and Grant stepped out, his face unreadable. He had his phone in one hand, a stack of papers in the other. Leo sat up straighter, his stomach twisting. "Did you find her?" Grant hesitated. "Not yet, but we found something." Leo's fingers curled against Rex's fur. "What?" Grant took a slow breath. A woman matching her description was seen 2 states away a few months ago. She was asking around, looking for a kid. "Your age, your name." Leo's chest tightened. She had been looking. She had actually been looking. His breath felt shaky, his hands gripping the fabric of his jeans. He wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified. "She's been moving around a lot," Grant continued, "which makes it harder to track her. But we're getting closer." Leo didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to ask why. Why had it taken so long? Why hadn't she found him sooner? Why hadn't she been here? But another part of him was too afraid of the answer. Because if she had been searching for him this whole time, then it meant he had been wrong about her. And if he had been wrong about that, what else had he been wrong about? Grant crouched in front of him, his expression softer than usual. "We're gonna find her, Leo. But I need you to be ready for that." Leo swallowed hard. "What if she doesn't want me anymore?" Grant's brows furrowed. "Kid, listen to me. She wouldn't have spent 2 years looking for you if she didn't want you." Leo wanted to believe that. He really did. But belief was hard when you had spent years teaching yourself not to hope. Rex nudged his arm again, warm and steady, keeping him grounded. Leo exhaled slowly. "Okay," he whispered. "Let's find her." The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions Leo didn't know how to process. Every hour that passed brought more questions, more uncertainty. He tried not to let the nervous energy show, but Grant noticed. And so did Rex. The dog barely left Leo's side, sensing the storm brewing inside him. Every time Leo felt like the thoughts were getting too loud, Rex was there, pressing against his leg, resting his big head on Leo's lap, grounding him. Grant had been working nonstop, making calls, pulling records, chasing every lead. And then, on the 3rd day, he walked into the room with a new look in his eyes. Something had changed. Leo sat up straight. "Did you find her?" Grant exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "We got a location. She was spotted at a shelter about 6 hours from here. She's still looking, still asking for you." Leo's chest tightened. This was real. For 2 years, he had convinced himself he was forgotten, that she had given up. But she hadn't. She had never stopped searching. His hands curled into fists against his jeans. He should feel happy, right? Relieved? Excited? So why did he feel terrified? Grant crouched down in front of him, his voice gentler than usual. "Leo, I need you to be sure about this. We can go to her, but I don't want to force you into something you're not ready for." Leo swallowed. He had spent so long running, so long believing he was alone. Now, the one thing he had stopped hoping for was right in front of him. But what if she didn't recognize him? What if she had changed? What if... A warm nose nudged against his palm. "Rex." Leo looked down at the dog, whose deep brown eyes were steady, calm, waiting. Leo exhaled shakily, his fingers threading through Rex's fur. "I want to go," he whispered. Grant studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, kid." And just like that, they were on the road. The drive was quiet. Leo sat in the back seat, his fingers curled into the fabric of his hoodie, Rex lying across the seat beside him. He kept his eyes locked on the passing scenery, his stomach twisting in knots. What if she wasn't the same? What if he wasn't the same? His mother had loved him once, but that was before he learned how to survive alone. Before he became a kid who broke into places and stole dog food just to get by. What if she didn't want this version of him? Rex let out a soft huff, his head resting against Leo's knee. Leo swallowed. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe he just had to find out. Grant glanced at him through the rearview mirror. Almost there, kid. Leo nodded, gripping the seatbelt tighter. The car turned down a quiet street, pulling up to a small shelter with a flickering neon sign in the window. Leo's pulse pounded against his ribs. This was it. The door to the shelter creaked open, and then she stepped out. Leo's breath caught in his throat. His mother. She looked different, tired, older, but the second her eyes locked onto him, everything else faded. Tears filled her eyes, and then she was running. Leo? Her voice cracked. Leo? Leo's legs moved before he could think. And then, for the first time in 2 years, he was in his mother's arms again. Leo had imagined this moment 1,000 times in his head. When he was sleeping under bridges, curled up in abandoned buildings, or digging through trash for scraps, he had let himself pretend, just for a second, that his mother would come back for him, that she would find him, scoop him up in her arms, and tell him everything would be okay. But he had also imagined the worst, that if she ever saw him again, she would turn away, that she had moved on, started a new life, and forgotten him. Now, as she held him, her arms wrapped tightly around him, shaking with quiet sobs, he didn't know what to do. He wanted to believe this was real, that he wasn't dreaming, that the woman crying into his hair was the same one who used to tuck him in at night and sing to him when he was scared. Slowly, hesitantly, he clutched onto her shirt. Her voice was shaking. I looked for you. I never stopped looking for you, Leo. Oh, my baby. Leo's chest tightened. She really had been looking. For 2 years. She had never stopped. The weight of it hit him all at once. The anger, the sadness, the relief, the fear. It was all too much. His fingers tightened in her shirt, his breath catching in his throat. Why did it take so long? He whispered. Why? She pulled back just enough to cup his face, her eyes red and filled with something unbreakable. I tried, baby. I tried so hard. But someone took you. You went missing, and I didn't know where to look. They told me you were gone, that I'd never find you. But I never stopped. I never gave up. Leo froze. Someone took him? His stomach twisted violently. His mother hadn't abandoned him. He had been stolen. The realization hit him like a punch to the chest. The foster homes, the streets, the endless running. It wasn't because his mother had left him. It was because someone had taken him away. His breath came faster, his hands shaking. Shoo, his mother whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. It doesn't matter now. You're here. You're safe. I have you. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body trembling. She hadn't given up on him. She had never stopped. And now, he wasn't alone anymore. A soft nudge against his arm made him look down. Rex. The dog was standing beside him, tail wagging slowly, his eyes warm and steady, like he had known this moment was coming all along. Leo sniffled, wiping his eyes. He reached out, running his fingers through Rex's fur. I guess I'm not going anywhere. Huh? His mother let out a soft, tearful laugh. Not without me, you're not. Grant cleared his throat from where he stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the reunion with something unreadable in his expression. Guess that means we've got some paperwork to do, he muttered. Leo's mother turned to him, her grip on Leo tightening. Thank you. Thank you for finding him. Grant smirked. It wasn't just me. You've got Rex to thank, too. Leo looked down at the dog, his chest swelling with something he didn't have words for. Rex had been the first to trust him, the first to make him feel safe again, the first to lead him home. Leo crouched down, wrapping his arms around the massive dog's neck. Thanks, buddy, he whispered. Rex huffed, leaning into him. It was over. He was safe. And for the first time in a long time, Leo finally had a home again. Epilogue. A year later, the police station was busier than usual. Officers bustling in and out, laughter and chatter filling the space. Grant leaned back in his chair, smirking as he watched a familiar figure walk through the door. Leo. Only now he wasn't a scared, lost kid anymore. His clothes were clean, his hair was neater, and he carried himself with a confidence he hadn't had before. But most importantly, Rex was still by his side. The boy had stayed, first as a guest, then as something more. Grant had worked it out with social services. Leo's mother had been given the support she needed, and Leo had started coming back to the station every day, learning how the K9 unit worked, training alongside Rex. Now, he was practically family. Look at you, Grant teased as Leo approached. Starting to look like a real cop. Leo rolled his eyes. I'm just helping out. Grant smirked. That's what they all say before they start filling out applications. Leo just laughed, shaking his head. He turned to Rex, scratching behind his ears. What do you think, boy? Should I stick around? Rex barked once, tail wagging. Leo smiled. For the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he belonged.